Last week, US President Donald Trump casually declared the US would strike Venezuela very soon. Then he asked reporters not to read too much into it, only to turn around and order all airlines to avoid Venezuelan airspace. He took to social media to say the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. This comes just days after Trump spoke with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro over a phone call, but remained tight-lipped about the details. Venezuela reacted to the warning, calling it a colonial threat. In reality, the US cannot legally strike Venezuela without Congress declaring war, and it can't mandate non-US airlines to avoid airspace belonging to another sovereign nation. Since 2019, direct flights between the two countries have already been barred under Trump's first presidency, but now the threat is more explicit. Still, the US lacks the authority for a unilateral air or military blockade. Why the pressure? The Trump administration blames Venezuela for shipping narcotics to the United States and reportedly struck vessels allegedly involved in drug trafficking, operations that have killed nearly 80 people since September. Moreover, the US does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as a legitimate leader. He has been widely accused of election fraud and seized office in 2019 despite stiff opposition. Joining us now to take this forward is Deepak Bhojwani, former Indian ambassador to Latin America. Ambassador Bhojwani, thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Bhojwani, how do you see the current tensions between US and Venezuela? What is prompting President Trump to make such strong remarks and threats against Venezuela and also the Venezuelan president?
Well, there has been a history of confrontation between the US and Venezuela for over 2 decades now. In fact, it goes back to the days when President Hugo Chavez was in power and he expropriated a lot of oil fields of the US companies. He raised taxes and so on, some of them left. Since then, Venezuela has been sort of under pressure. And after President Chavez died in 2013, his successor, President Maduro, who's still in power, was accused of rigging elections and staying in power illegally, not all of which is untrue. So what has happened is that the US, after repeated attempts to sort of dislodge him, and also after imposing sanctions, financial sanctions, etc., threatening other countries not to buy their oil, and then lifting sanctions slightly and then reimposing them in April this year. Apparently, Mr. Trump feels that now it's time for a regime change. And my belief is that this is an attempt at regime change. It started off, of course, as you know, as a broader kind of campaign by the US defense establishment to supposedly attack narco traffickers. I say supposedly because that's the allegation, that a lot of boats coming out of the Caribbean, Venezuela, Colombia, etc., carrying narcotics to the US, which is a national security threat for the US. And so the US has assumed it has the power to bomb them and even to kill the people on board. They've done this to about 21 boats, killed over 80 people, mostly accusing President Maduro of being the head of a drug smuggling cartel. So this is the background. Right. And now they've deployed a massive military presence, including naval ships, aircraft carrier, and so on.
Ambassador Bhojwani, do you expect US to be successful? Will Venezuela and President Nicolas Maduro, are they going to hit back?
I don't think Venezuela has the capability to fight back. I mean, if there's a ground invasion, which the Americans claim is not going to happen, and it would be very, very messy, very ugly, because what President Maduro has done is he's got the backing of the armed forces. At least this is, as far as I am aware, unless there has been a change in the situation and the armed forces have either been co-opted by the Americans and their allies, or there has been some kind of internal change. No one knows for certain, but President Maduro is braving it out, and he has what are called militias, popular militias, who are backing the revolution, the Venezuelan revolution, which basically was targeting the United States and its assets in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela happens to have the largest oil reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia, but they've been hardly exploited. Production has dipped drastically. Even the US companies have had to leave. Our Indian companies also are not currently producing there. We have joint ventures. The problem is that because of the sanctions, even we who have invested in Venezuelan oil fields, Indian companies, are not allowed to import Venezuelan oil. This is the power that the US has. But that power of sanctioning and trying to choke off the Venezuelan economy has not been enough. So who knows? I mean, they may find an excuse to go in. There could be some kind of incident whereby they accuse Venezuela of shooting down a US plane or attacking US Marines. It's hard to say.
Right.
But
Ambassador Bhojwani, do you believe that drug smuggling from Venezuela into United States is the only factor driving Trump, or there could be a larger aim of taking control of some of these oil reserves?
or absolutely, there's no question that the US has been trying this for decades. The fact of the matter is that in the 80s, Venezuela was a loyal ally of the US and everything went fine. The thing is, the change occurred when President Chavez took over at the beginning of the century. And he told the US that they were exploiting Venezuela. He raised taxes, he raised royalties. American companies walked out and they were not missed. Other companies moved in, including European, Indian companies, Chinese companies, above all, the Russians, and so on. And the US obviously felt left out. I mean, they didn't like it. Now, the fact of the matter is that this is, in my opinion, a clear attempt by the US at regime change. You would recall, and your viewers might recall, that Maria Corina Machado, a leading opposition figure, was granted the Nobel Prize. She has openly called on President Trump to depose Maduro. And they've tried earlier to put in an opposition figure in power and failed. So this could be an attempt at regime change, ramping up the pressure on Maduro to leave voluntarily with his faithful followers or whatever. But I mean, look, the fact is that there is a UN report which hardly, which maintains, and this is official documentation, you could check it for your viewers and for yourself, that Venezuela is not even responsible for 5% of the transit of drugs. It does not produce drugs.
Right.
These cocaine and other drugs are produced in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. That's where it comes from. Now, Venezuela is a transit country, but even that accounts for less than 5%, according to the UN report. And this cartel of the Suns, which is the Suns are the epaulets that the generals wear. So they call it cartel of the Suns, attributing it to the Venezuelan generals who are the drug smugglers, including President Maduro. It does not get named in the UN report also.
Right.
And there's a European report of the EU also, which is similarly not pointing any major fingers at Maduro. So this is clearly an attempt at regime change. And
Okay.
it's been done before.
Right. Do you, from the reports that we see, do you think Nicolas Maduro, his family, and his inner circle will get a safe passage? Because there are some reports saying that a deal has been struck. President Trump has been urging Maduro to leave the country.
Yeah, I saw a report today. I think it was in the Mint, a recent report saying there's some American Senator Mullen, if I'm not mistaken, who has said that he should go to Russia, take asylum there and just leave. And that's it. This is part of the game. The US basically wants, at minimal expense, militarily, etc., politically, to show that it can pressurize a regime. Okay, I'm not saying Nicolas Maduro is the most legitimate president in the world, but then how legitimate are a lot of other presidents, I would ask? And it's not the US's place to block off the airspace of a sovereign country, which is what they've declared they would do. Which means that if Air India wants to fly in, or a Chinese airliner wants to fly into Venezuela, they would be literally challenging the president of the United States. Now, I don't want it to happen.
That's a very important thing that you mentioned. But how do you think all of this is likely to end? Maduro has also called on OPEC nations to take action.
So OPEC isn't going to do anything. OPEC is a cartel. They run on the basis of a certain informal consensus or an agreement. And sometimes that consensus breaks down, and countries like Saudi Arabia go ahead and produce more or less anyway. So I don't think OPEC, and least of all the Arabs, are going to side with Venezuela against the United States. That's a dream that will not come true. But having said that, what Maduro is trying to do is reach out to anybody he can and everybody. He's in a spot. He's in a really tight spot. I haven't heard any statements from China or Russia, who would be his two major backers. Russia, definitely, they've supplied arms to him, and there are joint ventures where Venezuela produces these arms and so on. They've got Sukhois and missiles, but I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to say what's going to happen.
Right. Final question. What do you think is in all of this for India? What does India need to keep in mind when we see these tensions building up in Latin America, especially Venezuela?
Look, India is a player in Venezuela only to the extent that we have bought in the past large quantities of oil. Our refineries, particularly Reliance on the West Coast, is geared up to take even the heavy Venezuelan crudes. And at peak, if I remember right, we bought something like $11 billion of oil from Venezuela. We bought hundreds of thousands of barrels a day from them and the price was right. And despite the distance, the shipping and so on and so forth. So, but then this stopped when sanctions were imposed fully. We got some concessions from the US. See, the problem is that the US, with the almighty dollar, can force you to stop buying oil from a country. Otherwise, the companies that use those dollars to buy oil will be sanctioned. So that's how they managed to pressure us into not buying Venezuelan oil, which is in our interest. This is the only thing. Of course, there's a flip side to that coin. We have joint ventures in Venezuela where ONGC and its partners, Indian companies, have invested billions of dollars, and we were supposed to get paid back in oil or cash. The Venezuelans would sell the oil and pay us. Now, there's a debt of about $500 million when last I saw. It could be more, it could be around that figure. And the Venezuelans haven't had the money to pay us.
Right.
So Venezuela hasn't done us any favors either.
All right.
But these are the stakes. Our interest is in allowing oil to flow as much as possible so the prices come down, essentially.
All right.
But it's also our interest to ensure that a so-called rules-based world order is not completely destroyed, because that's what the US is doing if it does what it's planning to do.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhojwani, for joining us, for so beautifully explaining to us what's going wrong between US and Venezuela right now and the real intentions of the United States and the stakes for India as well.